The first time she felt the ground till beneath her feet again, it wasn't from grief or fear, but from the way the wind changed when he stepped into the doorway. For years, the widow had learned how to breathe shallow, careful breaths, the kind that never reached the places inside her that still hurt. But in that moment, something deep and forgotten stirred, and she realized that some wounds don't announce their healing with noise. They simply ache differently, until one day they don't ache at all. The town of Red Hollow had been built on dust and stubbornness. Men came here chasing gold, land, or a second chance, and most left with nothing but calloused hands and quieter dreams. The widow, Mara Ellison, had not come by choice. She had arrived wrapped in black, trailing a coffin behind a wagon, her eyes dry because she had already cried herself empty on the long road west. Her husband had been a decent man, a farmer who believed that hard work could tame any land. The land disagreed, and so did fate. By the time she was 32, Mara had buried love and learned the heavy math of survival. She ran a small boarding house at the edge of town, the kind that took in drifters, tired ranch hands, and men who needed a place to sleep without questions. She cooked, cleaned, and kept her sorrow tucked away like a letter she never intended to send. At night, when the lamps dimmed and the rooms filled with strangers breathing, she lay awake listening to the boards creak and told herself that loneliness was safer than hope. The cowboy arrived on a late afternoon when the sky burned orange and purple, as if the day itself were reluctant to leave. His horse was worn but steady, his hat pulled low, his coat dusty from miles of road. He carried himself like a man who had learned to keep moving because stopping hurt too much. When he dismounted, he paused, not because he was tired, but because he seemed unsure whether he was welcome anywhere at all. His name was Caleb Shaw, though names mattered less than intentions out here. People noticed the scar first, a thin white line along his jaw, a quiet reminder that life had once tried to take him and failed. He asked for a room with a voice that didn't expect kindness, only fairness. Mara gave him both without knowing why. Over the days that followed, his presence settled into the boarding house like a low, steady rhythm. He paid on time, helped fix a broken fence without being asked, and spoke little. But when he did, his words were careful, chosen like stones placed across a river. The other men came and went, loud with stories and whiskey, but Caleb lingered, as if he had nowhere else to be. Mara told herself not to notice the way he listened when she spoke, really listened, as if her words carried weight. She told herself not to notice how he always removed his hat when he passed her in the hallway, or how his eyes softened when he saw her trying to lift something too heavy alone. She had learned the cost of noticing before. Caleb had his own ghosts. Once, he had ridden with a bad crowd, men who believed the world owed them something, and that violence was a fair way to collect. One night, a line was crossed, and Caleb had crossed it too, even if his heart had been screaming to stop. The scar on his jaw was payment for his hesitation. He left that life bleeding and ashamed, carrying the weight of what he had almost become. Red Hollow didn't care about redemption stories. It cared about work and weather, and who you stood beside when things went wrong. When a drought tightened its grip and tempers flared, old resentments bubbled up. A local rancher accused Mara of shorting supplies. The words were sharp, public, and cruel. She stood there, cheeks burning, years of careful composure cracking. It was Caleb who stepped forward, not with threats or fists, but with facts and a calm that cut through the noise. He laid out the truth plainly, taking the heat onto himself without asking for anything in return. The rancher backed down, embarrassed more than defeated. When it was over, Mara's hand shook, the old familiar feeling of being alone in the world rushing back. That night, she couldn't sleep. The walls felt too close, the memories too loud. She stepped outside, the cool air brushing her skin, and found Caleb sitting on the porch, staring at the stars like they might answer questions he didn't dare ask. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Sometimes silence was the kindest thing two broken people could share. Days turned into weeks, and something between them grew, not fast and fiery, but slow and deep, like roots pushing through hard soil. They worked side by side, shared meals, and learned each other's rhythms. Mara spoke of her husband in fragments, careful not to let the grief spill. Caleb listened without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. Then trouble came the way it always did, sudden and unfair. The men from Caleb's past rode into town, their presence like a storm cloud. They recognized him immediately, not as the man he was now, but as the man he had been. They expected loyalty, or fear, or at least silence. Instead, they found resistance. When the confrontation came, it was ugly and loud. Words turned into shoves, shoves into blows. Caleb fought, not with the wild desperation of before, but with restraint, trying to end it without making it worse. A gun went off. No one died, but the sound echoed through Mara long after it faded from the street. Caleb was arrested, not because he was guilty, but because history had a way of outweighing truth. The town turned its back quickly. Redemption, it seemed, had limits. Mara visited him in the small, cold cell, her heart pounding like it might break free. She wanted to be strong, to say the right thing, but all that came out was honesty. She told him she was afraid, not of him, but of losing something she hadn't known she was allowed to want. The words left her shaking, exposed in a way she hadn't been since the day she buried her husband. Caleb felt something crack open then, something he had locked away out of self-punishment. He had believed he didn't deserve peace, or love, or a place to belong. Hearing her fear, her quiet courage, he realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing differently every day, even when the cost was high. The truth came out slowly, carried by witnesses who had seen who started the fight and who tried to stop it. Caleb was released, but the damage lingered. Some people would never forget where he came from. Some never needed to. Mara faced her own reckoning. Loving him meant risking pain again, opening herself to a future that wasn't guaranteed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the world in gold, she stood in the empty dining room, her chest tight, the old familiar panic rising. When Caleb stepped close, steady and warm, she felt it hit her all at once. The fear, the longing, the years of holding her breath. She couldn't breathe, not because of desire alone, but because she was finally standing at the edge of living again. He drew her close, not demanding, not urgent, but present in a way that anchored her. The shiver that ran through her wasn't just physical. It was the release of grief she had carried like a second spine. In his arms, she didn't feel weak. She felt human. Their relationship didn't fix everything. The land was still hard. The town still whispered. But together, they learned how to face mornings without dread and nights without emptiness. Caleb took on honest work, earning trust inch by inch. Mara laughed more, a sound that surprised her every time it escaped. Years later, people would say the widow and the cowboy saved each other. The truth was simpler and braver than that. They chose each other, again and again, despite fear, despite history, despite the scars. Red Hollow changed too, quietly, the way real change happens. Not everyone got a happy ending, but enough did to make hope contagious. The boarding house became a home. The cowboy became a man known not for his past, but for his presence. And if you listen closely to stories like this, whispered through time and dust, you'll hear the same truth repeated in 100 different ways. No matter how deep the hurt, no matter how long you've held your breath, it's never too late to inhale again. Healing doesn't erase the past, but it can soften it, shape it into something that no longer controls you. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in the wildest, harshest places, the human heart can still find its way home, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Here at Legends of the Wild West, we believe the greatest battles aren't always fought with guns, but with courage, forgiveness, and the quiet decision to live fully again. The night after everything changed, Red Hollow felt strangely quiet, as if the town itself were holding its breath. The stars burned brighter than usual, sharp points of light against the endless black, and the wind carried the smell of dry earth and distant rain that might never come. Mara lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling, her heart still learning a new rhythm. For the first time in years, her thoughts were not circling loss, but possibility, and that frightened her more than grief ever had. Caleb slept little too. He sat on the porch long after the lamps were blown out, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped as if in prayer. Freedom still felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with one wrong move. He knew how easily the past could reach out and drag a man backward. But now there was something anchoring him, something warm and real that made the future feel worth defending. Morning came with pale light, and the sound of Mara moving about the kitchen. The familiar routine steadied them both. Coffee was brewed, bread sliced, and for a while, life pretended to be simple again. Yet beneath every small action ran a current of unspoken understanding. They had crossed a line together, one that could not be uncrossed. The town did not forget quickly. Some faces softened when Caleb passed, others hardened. A few men nodded, acknowledging the way he had stood his ground without bloodshed. Others spat into the dirt, convinced a man could never outrun his history. Mara felt the looks too, the quiet judgments aimed at a widow who had dared to open her heart again. She held her head high, even when her hands trembled. Trouble rarely announces itself loudly. It creeps in through practical worries and small failures. The drought worsened, and supplies grew scarce. Travelers stopped coming. The boarding house, once just enough to survive on, began to feel like a sinking ship. Mara ran numbers late into the night, her stomach tight with fear she hadn't felt since her husband's final illness. Caleb noticed, of course. He noticed everything now. He took on more work, riding out before dawn and returning after dark, exhausted but determined. He repaired fences for neighbors who barely thanked him, hauled water for ranches that eyed him warily, and saved every coin he earned. Pride had once been his armor, now humility was. One afternoon, a storm finally broke over Red Hollow, violent and sudden. Rain lashed the land, turning dust into mud, thunder cracking so close it rattled windows. The boarding house roof, old and tired, gave way in two places. Water poured in, soaking the floor, threatening to undo years of careful maintenance. Mara stood in the dining room, watching the rain fall inside her home, and felt something inside her collapse. She sank to her knees, the sound of the storm drowning out her quiet sobs. It wasn't just the roof. It was the years of holding on, the constant fight against forces bigger than her, the fear that hope had been a mistake. Caleb found her there, soaked and shaking. He knelt beside her, rain dripping from his hair, and for once he didn't try to be strong. He let her see the worry in his eyes, the way this mattered to him too. Together, they worked through the storm, dragging buckets, patching what they could, laughing weakly at their own stubbornness even as exhaustion set in. When the rain finally eased, the damage was clear, but so was something else. They had faced it side by side, not as landlord and boarder, not as widow and drifter, but as partners. The realization settled between them like a promise neither dared to say out loud yet. The next weeks were hard. Repairs cost money they didn't have. Caleb suggested selling his horse, the one thing that had carried him through every chapter of his life. Mara argued, tears in her eyes, but he was firm. Some things, he said quietly, were meant to carry you to a place where you no longer needed them. When the horse was led away, Caleb stood very still, his jaw tight. Mara reached for his hand, grounding him. She understood sacrifice now in a deeper way. Love, she was learning, wasn't about holding on. It was about letting go when it mattered most. Word of their struggle spread, slowly and unexpectedly. A rancher whose fence Caleb had fixed showed up with spare lumber. A woman who had stayed at the boarding house years before sent money with a note of gratitude. Even the man who had once accused Mara unfairly arrived one morning, awkward and silent, offering help. Redemption, it turned out, could ripple outward in ways no one planned. As the boarding house was rebuilt, stronger than before, so were they. Caleb spoke more of his past, not to confess, but to release it. Mara spoke of her husband with less pain, remembering love without drowning in loss. They learned each other's fears, and met them gently, without judgment. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the land glowed amber, Caleb stopped in the doorway of the kitchen, his heart pounding harder than any gunfight he had ever known. He spoke simply, without grand promises. He told her he couldn't give her certainty, only effort. He told her he wanted to stay, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he had finally found somewhere he belonged. Mara listened, her chest tight, then eased, like a knot finally undone. She realized she wasn't afraid of loving him anymore. She was afraid of not loving him enough, of not being brave enough to claim joy when it was offered. She stepped closer, resting her forehead against his, and in that quiet space, she chose life again. Seasons passed. The land healed a little. So did the people. The boarding house filled with laughter and stories once more. Caleb became a fixture in town, not as a legend or a warning, but as a man who showed up when it mattered. Mara's smile grew easier, her laughter freer, her breathing deep and unguarded. Years later, travelers would ask about the widow and the cowboy, about how two broken lives had intertwined and endured. The answer was never dramatic. They stayed. They worked. They forgave. They chose love not once, but every day. And that is the quiet truth the Wild West rarely tells. Survival is not the same as living. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the decision to open your arms when every instinct tells you to protect your heart. If this second chapter touched you, if it reminded you that healing is a journey made of small, brave steps, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Here at Legends of the Wild West, we believe the strongest stories are about ordinary people who dared to hope again, and found that hope was stronger than fear.